Hey everybody, I hope that you all had a good Halloween weekend, albeit, socially distant one. I hope you all got to, eat some candy, do some fun stuff. So this week we are getting into some conversations about labor and thinking about how various dimensions of labor take shape in a digital economy. So thinking about how do we conceptualize what labor looks like when so much of our activities take shape in digital spaces. So first we're looking at this piece from Brooke Aaron Duffy, which, it's an excerpt from this larger work called Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love. And, she's looking at the ways that, Instagrammers as well as bloggers narrativize their own paths. So she's specifically looking at people that establish themselves as getting to a point where they could generate money, they could generate, some form of income from their digital presence. And she's thinking about how do they tell the story of how they got where they are. And so she talks about how some of them discuss this as, a side hustle that they intentionally turned into something that would be, an established money making scheme. Other people, talk about how it was this labor of love that like somehow grew into, something that promised a form of stability for them. So it's interesting to think about as we dive into, the ways those folks narrativize their paths, how we conceptualize this concept of digital labor in relation to it. So thinking about how, with these different, Instagrammers and bloggers and whatnot, there is this question of the ways that they discuss how various forms of activities like spending all of this time responding to tagged comments, spending hours curating a photo shoot and just getting the right lighting and things like that. How do they articulate that form of labor? So thinking about how that form of labor in some ways does, turn into a value generating activity, and it does, in large part function to, contribute to, a larger money making venture. But how do they talk about these forms of labor that are not technically on the clock? So thinking about how so many forms of that labor, they occupy this complicated space of labor and leisure. So I'm sure that this will be interesting for you all to think about in considering how so much of our lives take shape on digital spaces and whatnot, and how do we identify the labor that we put into digital platforms. And we touched on this a little bit before in class, but thinking about for folks that you may see in your own networks that are generating income in some way from their social media presence. How do they talk about that kind of labor that goes into that behind the scenes work, especially when there's an aspirational quality to it? So they may not necessarily be making money yet, but they seek to become an entity or a brand in social media spaces that ultimately does make money. So how do you articulate that behind the scenes work that is off the clock but is ultimately intended to become something that makes some bucks? So, in order to delve into, what, different dimensions of digital labor look like, we break it up this week into thinking about hope labor, relational labor, and gig labor. So, first and foremost, let's think about, how do we conceptualize hope labor? And hope labor would take shape as, any kind of work that, has an aspirational quality where economic stability is not offered currently for that labor that you're, creating, but you hope that in the future it will generate economic stability. So we see hope labor, energizing various forms of, participation in online spaces. And, we see that particularly, a great example would be, creating a website when, you don't really have the money to, put all of this work into an online presence, but you're hoping that, potential employers are going to see this and, it's going to, ultimately, offer you a job in the future. Unpaid internships are, a really key form of hope labor. So thinking about how often folks will take on unpaid internships because they have the hope of, that ultimately, translating into a stable gig for themselves, a stable job. So thinking about hope labor being, this one form of labor that, we see taking shape in a big way in our contemporary digital economies. We're also thinking about relational labor. So relational labor is, it's a concept that was coined by this digital media scholar, Nancy Baim, and she used it to help think through the ways that budding musicians in social media spaces were offering value generating activities to those spaces, with the hopes that, they would create some kind of name for themselves. But, where relational labor distinguishes itself from hope labor, they are, in various ways intertwined and can be in conversation. But relational labor tends to have this affective quality to it. So, once again, that word coming up that media scholars love. And affect, refers to any kind of feeling and emotion that is put into, the work that you're offering to a space. So, in the sense of, say a musician that's trying to make a name for themselves, in social media spaces, that kind of, emotional output that you're putting into responding to tagged comments, to demonstrating various forms of reciprocity where, people are engaging with you somehow, so you feel the need to, respond in kind and whatnot. So, there is this, very significant, emotional quality to it because you're putting in, so much emotional work to the brand that, you may be building for yourself. And relational labor is also interconnected with, the various forms of invisible labor that, labor scholars have been looking at for, a great deal of time when it comes to, say, service with a smile. So, relational labor would take shape as, say you're working a service job, serving people coffee, working at a movie theater and whatnot, and the pressure to maintain a smile and politeness when, say someone's yelling at you. So that kind of expectation and the sort of energy that, is put into maintaining service with a smile is also understood as a form of relational labor in terms of the output of, emotion that, it's expending for people. So finally, we're looking at gig labor, and gig labor distinguishes itself from relational and hope labor in that it is paid, but it demonstrates the kind of shift in, or profound shift in our contemporary economy to prioritizing freelance contract work as opposed to offering people, full-time benefits-driven work. So we've seen in the last few decades this significant shift towards, contract and freelance labor that, essentially for, a giant corporation would make, it would preserve their bottom line. It would make, the company more efficient because they're able to pay workers less. So very often we're seeing, people coming out of college today with degrees, and a lot of the jobs that are available to them are, contract work, a lot of freelance work, not as many, full-time benefits driven opportunities. So everywhere from, journalism to service work to, universities, there, is, a huge push towards having that kind of, efficient, flexible, contract driven job. So we'll be talking about this a little bit on the Discord board this week, and I'm interested to see how you all see these different forms of labor taking shape, relational, hope, as well as gig work, and how you see COVID impacting gig work especially. So I look forward to hearing what you all have to say.